Hi, everyone. This lecture will be on chapter one, looking at the history and scope of psychology. We'll look a little bit at the roots and history of psych, which is an absolutely massive topic, but we'll look at just kind of some of the big events. We'll look at psychology's big question of nature versus nurture, talk a little bit about some of the different subfields, some truths and myths, and finally wrap it up with some careers in psychology. So very exciting first lecture. All right, so here we go. But if we look at psychology's roots, psychology has a lot of roots in philosophy. Now, psychology has been around for a long time, but before it was its own formal discipline, we can safely say that we see a lot of its roots in some of the famous philosophers and in that very kind of philosophical thinking. If you look even at the word psychology, it comes from the Greek words of psyche and logos, which if you put that together, we're looking at the study of the soul, the spirit, or the mind. Now that has changed a little bit over time. It's evolved and we'll get there. But in its original days, right, psychology was the study of the soul, the spirit, or the mind. And some of the people really making those big questions that we even still focus on today, people like Aristotle, Plato, John Locke, sitting around and wondering about what is it that makes us who we are. Are we born the way that we will always be, or are we born more of like a blank slate that we're then written on by the environment? And so some of those philosophers have laid down some pretty heavy roots for us that would later evolve and become psychology. Now, as I mentioned, psychology has a very long history. It's been around for a long time, and there's a lot of big events that have happened and a lot of shifts. Psychology is constantly shifting and changing. There's like a new dominant theory or paradigm every few years. So let's look at a couple of kind of the big shifts that have happened over time. In the beginning days, as we mentioned, psychology was more of a philosophical focus, wondering and thinking about human behavior. As we move forward a little bit in time, we became very much into spirituality. A lot of early psychology studied the spirit and things like demonic possession causing mental illness. We've since moved on from that, though it still comes up periodically. If we move into the 1700s, some big things like mesmerism, which would later kind of transform into more of like a hypnosis and therapy kind of orientations. In the 1800s, phrenology was coined and developed by Franz Gall, looking at bumps on the skull and to see how they correlate to human behavior. We have a very famous accident that occurred. A man named Phineas Gage, who had a railroad rod, say that three times fast, go through his head. We'll talk more about him when we get to chapter 3 in a couple of weeks. In the 1800s, we also saw kind of a shift happening of trying to make psychology more into a science. Wilhelm Wundt founded psychology's first psychology laboratory. In the 1800s, Sigmund Freud began providing therapy to his patients. Late 1800s, around 1880s or so. The American Psychological Association was formed in 1892 by G. Stanley Hall, a very, very strong organization that's still present today. The early 1900s, we saw a lot of ideas of conditioning. Ivan Pavlov in his studies with dogs and classical conditioning, which we'll definitely talk about later in the semester. Lobotomies being formalized, looking at kind of strange and bizarre ways of curing mental illness in the early 1900s. And as we get into about the 1950s or so, we started to see some of the first drugs being developed to help with things like schizophrenia or psychosis, depression, and so on. So lots of shifts, even in this first one. We have one more half of the timeline here, but a really important one to note, this one in 1879, really marked a big change in the field where psychology went from being more philosophical to actually being a science, right? And we are currently a science now, and so we've embraced that mentality ever since. Let's look at the second half as we kind of get up to today and up to our current definition and focus of psychology. In the 1950s, we also saw the development and publishment of the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, a very important book for mental illness. Humanistic psychology was a very dominant field in the 1950s as well. The third force in psychology, a very positive branch that we'll talk more about. We also saw cognitive psychology come onto the scene, looking at our thinking processes and expectations and stereotypes, our mind and thoughts dictating how we perceive the world. The 1970s were dominated by evolutionary psychology, looking at natural selection and trends and survival of the fittest, and all these different interesting evolutionary trends that were related to our field. In the 1980s, we were dominated by neuroscience, brain imaging, psychopharmacology, starting to look at genetics, right, and how medications and physiology could affect somebody's functioning. In the 1990s, we were dominated by cultural psychology, looking at the impact of other people and different cultures and how that might shape who we are. The 1990s, we also saw a lot of technology coming into the field, right? Looking at e-therapy and technology playing a big role in the way that we view the world and do therapy and perform all sorts of different functions. And then in the 2000s, we have the human genetic code being a really big focus. As we get into today, we see a lot of what we call epigenetics, right? We're even going one step beyond and looking at how the environment can actually alter our genetics. Above or beyond our genetics is what epigenetics would mean. And so we're kind of evolving constantly. As I said, if you look at this every few years or maybe even every decade or so, has kind of had a different focus. And if we were to fast forward, I'm sure there would be new ones. So it'll be interesting to see where the field goes and what the focus will be as we continue into the future. So as we get to today, our current definition of psychology, we define psychology as the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. So the neat thing about this is, even if this is the only psychology class you ever take, it definitely relates to just about everything, right? The study of behavior, everything that you do, and mental processes, everything that you think and everything that you feel. So we're going to talk about a lot of different things over the semester, from how the brain works and how neurons fire, to motivation and emotion, development, personality, and we'll look at some of those mental illnesses and treatments a little bit more as well. So lots of fun topics for us to cover over the course of the semester. There's a lot of famous faces in psychology as well, and you'll see every single one of these with the exception of the first one again. In this first chapter, we're kind of introducing a lot of concepts that we're going to get to and kind of dive into a little bit more later on, except for this guy. This is Wilhelm Wundt. This is the one who made psychology a science back in the 1800s. This is his one moment of glory. So say hello and goodbye to Wilhelm. But otherwise, you'll see the rest of these people later on. Probably one of the most famous faces in psychology. This is Sigmund Freud. It's easy to tell who Freud is because he almost always has a cigar, right? Very, very addicted to cigars. It's actually what killed him. He died of cancer of the mouth from smoking cigars his entire life. But probably one of the most famous faces and psychologists. We'll talk about him a little bit more. This is Carl Jung, one of my favorite psychologists. He was the beloved son of Sigmund Freud, one of his pupils that kind of split off and formed some new theories in a different direction. Right, we'll talk about him as well, right? We have Carl Rogers, right, that we'll talk about, Albert Bandura. I'm just giving you the wrong names here. I'm so sorry. John Watson, it's early, I need some coffee. John Watson, a very famous behaviorist, and B.F. Skinner, right? Also a very famous behaviorist. We'll talk about both of them in the learning unit. Watson, very famous for his studies with little Albert. B.F. Skinner, famous for his Skinner boxes and his studies that were done with rats and pigeons and ideas of conditioning. This is Abraham Maslow, a famous humanistic psychologist who we'll talk about with his hierarchy of needs. This is Carl Rogers, very well known for some of his therapy techniques. And then Albert Bandura, sorry again, I gave you the wrong names for a moment there. And Albert Bandura, who is a very big social learning theorist. And I want you to notice, if you look at this slide, if you look at these people who dominated the early field of psychology, you'll notice that all of them are kind of white or European, middle class to upper class, educated men. Older men at that as well. And the early parts of the field were very much dominated by men who were from like a European or Caucasian like background. And that changed quite a bit as we evolved over time. But these are some of the most famous faces in psychology. And again, we'll talk about each one of them, except for Wilhelm, over the rest of the semester. Psychology has a really big question that it poses with everything, nature versus nurture. And I'm sure you've heard this before, and this will be one of the topics of the discussions that you'll be looking at. But nature versus nurture is this controversy over the contributions of biology versus experience. And it really should be nature and nurture, because both of them do play a pretty predominant role in determining how we function and what we do, our personality, our intelligence, our orientation. The list goes on and on and on as far as what these things can contribute to. But nature refers to what comes to us naturally, what we are born or equipped with naturally. This is something that is typically inherited. We talk about genetics and DNA, biology. What do we have that makes up our nature, our biological makeup? And again, typically referencing genetics. Nurture is the other side of the coin that looks at experiences, the environment, learning. What have we learned and been exposed to? And so we often ask this with big questions in the field. You know, what is it that determines our personality? Were we born with our personality already in place? Is it completely due to genetics? Or does our personality develop as a result of learning and experiences? And if you ever want to sound brilliant in psychology, the easy answer is it's almost always a combination of both. You could say a combination of both factors led to X, and you're almost always going to be right. But this is something that we'll definitely look at, the relative contributions of biology and experience in the environment on whatever attribute or trait that we are trying to examine. Really interesting documentary a few years ago, controversial but interesting. Three Identical Strangers. We often study nature versus nurture in the form of twin studies, or in this case, triplet studies, especially twins or triplets that have been separated at birth. When we examine them, we can often see and try to attribute what things have been determined more by biology versus the environment. And twin and even triplet studies provide a wonderful area for us to go ahead and try and do that. There are some other things that we could add to the nature and nurture question. So we can look at biology, psychology, and social and cultural influences on whatever behavior or mental process we're studying. So take, for example, if we were trying to study addiction, why is it that people might become addicted to or abuse substances? We might look at what are some of the biological influences that might push somebody in that direction. What are some of the psychological influences that maybe they have learned, or responses that they're having? And then what are some of the social and cultural influences, like the presence of other people, peer pressure, and so on, and how all of those things can kind of collide together to push somebody toward a behavior or shape and influence a behavior or trait that we are examining. So again, you'll see this many times over the semester as we examine lots of different behaviors and mental processes, but we're complicated beings. So we got to look at a lot of different factors whenever we're trying to kind of make some of those assertions. There are lots of different subfields of psychology, absolutely massive discipline. And there's a lot of different sub areas or subfields that people tend to become involved in. There's a really wonderful video that I have linked for you in the lecture on Canvas. So I'm not going to talk about these here because I'm hoping that you will watch that video. Definitely some great information, things that will appear on the exam. But look for all of these and then some. There are quite a few different areas, from more of a developmental focus to personality, social psych, all of the counseling fields, experimental, the list goes on and on and on. There are an absolute ton of subfields and jobs within the realm of psychology. I do want to make one distinction though. They talk about this a little bit in the documentary, but it can sometimes get a little confusing. Clinical psychologists, counseling psychologists, and psychiatrists are all different things, but sometimes they all get called therapists. And so I just want to take a moment and tell you a few of the key differences. And there's a really great chart that I made in the textbook on this as well. But a clinical psychologist is typically somebody who has a PhD, right? They've gone to through more education, they have more training, And so they tend to study, assess, and treat people who have tend to have more severe pathology, right? So people who are more diagnosed with psychological disorders, they're providing therapy of some sort. So tending to deal with a little bit more severe populations, including assessment and treatment. Counseling psychologists, on the other hand, tend to have a master's degree. In California, we tend to call these individuals MFTs, or marriage and family therapists. But a counseling psychologist tends to deal more with everyday problems: stress, anxiety, relationships, communication. Not to say that a counseling psychologist might not see someone who's been diagnosed with a mental illness, but typically they don't tend to deal with as severe of populations as clinical psychologists do, because they have less education and less training. Psychiatrists, on the other hand, are unique in which they are medical professionals. They have an MD, or a medical degree, and they are able to prescribe medications to treat their patients. They don't tend to do therapy. They tend to do more of like a short check-in, looking at side effects and symptoms and how somebody's tolerating their medication. So it's pretty common that somebody might see a psychiatrist and then also one of these two individuals at the same time, so that they're getting a little bit of resources, not only for medication, but also for therapy as well. I mentioned the APA earlier. The American Psychological Association is one of the largest organizations within the field of psychology, hundreds of thousands of members worldwide. I have this linked on our lecture on Canvas if you wanted to go. It's a great website to check out. It has lots of information about psychology, careers, and just about anything you want to know about psychology. It's a great starting point. apa.org. It's hyperlinked here in the slides and then also on Canvas. A couple of myths and facts, and then we'll look at some jobs before we wrap up this very short chapter 1. But these would be some great true, false questions for you on the first exam. Some myths and facts about the field of psychology. One very popular myth is that psychology is simply common sense. In reality, psychology is a science. It's scientific, and we use scientific methods to think about and try and answer questions. Another myth is that psychology only focuses on abnormal behavior, when in reality, psychology studies both normal and abnormal behavior. You have to define what is normal or typical in order to understand when things are deviant or different from what we would define as normal or typical. Another myth: psychologists all share similar perspectives and approaches to analyzing information. In reality, psychology embraces many different perspectives, lots of different subfields. Again, watch the video that's linked on Canvas. So lots of different perspectives and ways of approaching information. Psychology is all old theories and textbooks. Not true. It's ever changing and all around you. If you watch an hour of TV, I guarantee you will see concepts that we're talking about in action. There'll be commercials that are related to some of the medications that we'll talk about. We're constantly learning and growing, and the field is always evolving, as you saw with the timeline that we looked at earlier. And finally, if you're interested in working in the field of psychology, you must want to be a therapist. Lots of people go into being a therapist or a social worker or a counselor or one of those related professions, but it's not just therapy that psychology focuses on. There's a wide range of career options, all sorts of different things that you can do within the field. And that's kind of the last thing that we'll talk about here. It's a very degree dependent field. So depending on the level of degree you have, different things open up to you for possibilities. At Moorpark, you can get an associate's degree in psychology, an AA, and this will help you with some of the more paraprofessional positions where you can work in human service settings, maybe in a state hospital kind of setting. Typically, people who have an associate's degree in psychology, it just kind of gives them a leg up over the competition in different human service setting jobs. Not a lot of psychology specific things at that level, but there are quite a few more options once you get a bachelor's degree. With a bachelor's degree, you can work in a correctional center, you can assist psychologists in mental health centers, be a research assistant, teach psychology in high school, work with within the government or within certain businesses. Lots of more options open up here at the bachelor's level. But a lot of the ones that we tend to think of right off the bat require a master's degree or a doctorate. If you have your MA or a PhD, you can work in colleges and universities as a professor. You can be a researcher, an educational psychologist, industrial organizational management consulting positions, a counselor, a therapist, so many different options. And sometimes it can be a little bit overwhelming how many options and choices there are. But that website, that apa.org, is a great place to start if you want to know more about some careers in psychology. And as a side note, so I have a master's degree in counseling psych. I am actually trained as a marriage and family therapist. I went through 1,500 hours of doing therapy before deciding that I wanted to be a professor instead. But with my associate's degree in psychology, I'm going to make myself sound old here. I managed a warehouse music, which are no longer around. And I also worked at Starbucks and REI. With a bachelor's degree, I still worked at Starbucks. I worked at Starbucks all the way through my master's. It was a great source of free caffeine. And I actually really grew to love it. But with a bachelor's degree, I was a therapeutic behavioral aide, helping children with behavioral struggles. I also was a teaching assistant, and as I mentioned, still working at Starbucks. With a master's degree, I have been an EOPS counselor, an academic advisor, a marriage and family therapist intern doing family, couple, and individual therapy. And then I've also now been a professor for about 12, 13 years, working at various colleges and universities. So lots of different options open up for you, but again, they tend to be very degree dependent. So that concludes the lecture for chapter 1. Make sure that you get going on all the other required weekly materials, and I will see you for the chapter 2 lecture that will be coming up next time.